organization. On behalf of CAM, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge our sponsor for the Lunch and Learn webinars and the Technology Fellow Program, and that is Associated Foundations Incorporated. We are very thankful for their support. The Technology Fellow programs are offered in memory of Barry Herlihy, a devoted CAM board member and strong supporter of the California Museum field who passed away in 2016. We're thankful for the opportunity to remember him in this way, as technology was something that he always loved to take part in or tinker in, as David has said. Now I'm happy to introduce CAM's Technology Fellow and the speaker for today's webinar, David Canfield. David has been the Vice President and Chief Information Officer at the Pacific Battleship Center since 2012, where he gets to tinker and apply his deep-seated experience in technology. He left a 20-plus year career in the Silicon Valley to serve on the ship that he grew up on. His passion and dogged leadership has attracted a robust crew of volunteer IT specialists from all over the country to put the Battleship Iowa at the forefront of technology innovation. Welcome, David. The show is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be named the Technology Fellow, and a real privilege to be able to do this. Today's talk is going to be on off-the-shelf and scrappy technology solutions, or ideas on how technology can be deployed without breaking the bank, using commercially available products in some pretty unique ways. It's being presented today, as you can no doubt see, from aboard the Battleship Iowa in the Port of Los Angeles. Celeste did a wonderful job of all of those things after my name, so I'll skip that. I do want to acknowledge the California Association of Museums for the Lunch and Learn program and for the Technology Fellowship. I also want to thank my employer, the Battleship Iowa, soon to become the National Museum of the Surface Navy at the Battleship Iowa. And of course, I want to acknowledge Associated Foundations who are, as Celeste said, sponsoring the CAM Technology Fellowship in memory of Barry. Barry did wonderful things around the museum world all throughout the state of California. This is one of my favorite pictures of him. He is ringing the bell here for yet another 1,000 hours of service right here aboard Battleship Iowa. So Barry and I became really good friends, and he really inspired me to sort of push the envelope here. The purpose of the presentation is to provide a catalyst of thought and discussion about how museums can use readily available and inexpensive solutions for displays and guest interaction. I worked for a long time at Hewlett-Packard. One of the required slides in an HP presentation was to set expectations, and I want to do that here. Although we will have a demo, this presentation is not about providing turnkey solutions for a particular problem. Really what we want to do is start a conversation about the real and imagined barriers to the use of technology, especially within the museum environment. So what we intend to do, we want this to be kind of informal. I'll stop at a couple of points and allow comments or questions. I would love to spark a discussion, particularly at the end of the slide set. I'm going to provide an example of a couple solutions that we've produced here, and I want to talk about possibilities. What I don't want to do is I don't want to be attributional. It's really easy when you start talking about technology to say my solution's right, nobody else's is, or to bash vendors or suppliers, and I don't want to do that. Along those lines, I certainly don't want to be confrontational. A choice of technology or a technology strategy really is specific to the institution, and there is no one size fits all. And so what works for one organization may not work at all for another. We are not going to provide a specific roadmap. Again, a technology strategy is something that is very specific to the institution and in meeting the needs that that institution has to service their constituency. And it is not an endorsement of any particular product or provider, although I am a shameless advocate for the Raspberry Pi, which we will see later on. Again, here, the goal is to start a conversation and to really hopefully think outside the box on what we can do. So our agenda, we're almost through our introduction and pleasantries. When I worked at Sprint, we always had the first 5 or 10 minutes of a meeting were pleasantries that allowed people to get on late. I'm going to talk very briefly about my background, and then I'll share my first experience here at the museum with technology, We'll talk a little bit about what it means to be scrappy. I'll introduce my favorite tool in the Scrappy realm, and that's Raspberry Pi, and then we'll build a practical example, and I'll follow that with some caveats and warnings and other indications of doom, and we'll have some question and answer. All right, this is me, the charming young fellow in the upper left is a 19-year-old me aboard the Battleship Iowa in 1989. The bottom right is just before I left Google to come here to the ship. And I honestly didn't have a current picture, so that's kind of now-ish. I have a Bachelor of Science in Interdisciplinary Sciences from New York Institute of Technology. I did, as Celeste said, 20 years or more in Silicon Valley working for some names you may recognize. And during that same time, I was doing a 21-year career in the Naval Reserve, some of which was on active duty. The first 2 years here on Battleship Iowa, 11 years in a special warfare unit, although not a SEAL, and 8 years in what is now called naval information warfare, working on some really interesting products like providing a full-time internet connection to ships at sea and the Foster Miller EOD robotics program. And for the last 7 years, I've been back on board the Iowa, which is now a museum here in the Port of Los Angeles. When I first came on board Iowa full-time, I had been a volunteer and I had worked doing a bunch of different things, but had the distinction of having brought the internet to the battleship. And when they finally hired me, I came on board and I was faced with the first solution that the museum had purchased. It was a theater solution, and they had purchased a cloud-managed theater appliance. I've gone ahead and blurred the name and model number on here because, again, I don't want to specifically call out any vendor. So we purchased this because it was cloud managed. It came with 8 42-inch LCD screens, and it spread the video across all 8 of those screens. And it included installation and management and support, and all in cost $30,000, and that included the hardware and the installation. So there were some pros to taking this approach. This was a very reliable solution. It was an incredibly well-engineered solution. There were some very pleasant professional people on the other end of the phone, and it was incredibly easy to manage. I could log into a website from anywhere in the world and swap out video, and it was completely turnkey. We plugged it in, we loaded the video, and we basically forgot about it. There were also some cons to this solution, and the first one was it was really, really expensive. $30,000 when we had not yet brought the first visitor through the door was an incredibly large outlay for us to make. Secondly, did I mention it was really, really expensive? My IT budget even today is less than $5,000 per month, not counting labor, and that includes internet and phone service. So when we opened, the theater was 72% of my entire annual IT budget, and I hadn't even bought a laptop for somebody to do the books on. That made me wonder what was under the hood, and could I get by without the appliance if I had to? And so in examining what we found in the appliance, it contained a 2-year-old Mac Mini, 2 50-watt amplifiers, a networking switch, a power supply, and a couple various cables, and a really nicely engineered case. So I went out to Amazon preparing for this presentation, and I said, what can I find to build this same basically hardware setup? So a 2-year-old Mac Mini today, that would be a 2017, I can get refurbished for under $500. I could not find 50-watt amplifiers. I could only find 100-watt amplifiers, but typically if some is good, more is better. So those run under $50 a piece. The networking switch is kind of unnecessary. The Ethernet specification says you can't put a bullet connector in line. And so what this did was connect the outside of the case to the computer proper. And so that's unnecessary if we're building it ourselves. The few cables that are in here, HDMI splitter, etc., we could pick up for around $100, and a 42-inch LCD display runs about $300. So the cost to build the solution in-house in terms of hardware is about $3,100, which is close to an order of magnitude difference. Now, that's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, and forgive the pun on the Mac there. The reality is service is a big deal. It's a tremendously big deal, often worth the cost paid. And I don't want to downplay the fact that that system did come with service and had a number of very professional and pleasant people on the other end of the phone. The labor for the installation obviously took some of that money, and I did not include that in the build cost. And although the Mac that I specified can be managed remotely, there's no specific cloud management software included in my cost estimate. And of course, if it's built in-house, it's certainly not turnkey. So there are reasons why you want to buy a canned appliance or something that is specific, sold by a vendor to meet a very specific need. But what if you can't afford it? If you can't afford it, it does not always mean that the interaction you are after or the capacity that you are after is out of reach. You can be scrappy and build it yourself, often with stuff you can buy right off the shelf from Fry's or Amazon, or in my case, I troll thrift stores, whatever I can get. The word scrappy is kind of interesting. The other word that's often used for it is GarageBand. But I like the word scrappy. I heard that word first from the executive director of World War II Museum when we were in Louisiana, and his comment in looking at some of what we had done was, don't ever stop being scrappy. Sometimes the GarageBand solution is not wrong. I like to point out that some great things have started in garages. A good portion of my career in Silicon Valley was with Hewlett-Packard, and that picture on the right there is Bill Hewlett and David Packard looking into the garage in which they started their company well over 50 years ago. So what does being scrappy mean? The first thing is scrappy is kind of an attitude. And the first point I always come back to is don't ever frame a conversation around what we can't do. What we really need to be talking about is what we can do. What can we do to meet the need or to reach out to our constituents or to give our guests a better experience? Secondly, don't be afraid to do it in-house, GarageBand style. Often people look down on that GarageBand or in-house, but there are a number of very, very professional people who volunteer, and I know a number of very professional people who are employed in the museum field. Just because somebody is a volunteer or works for a museum does not mean that they don't have some pretty serious technical chops and can get it done. Thirdly, be creative in your use of equipment or devices and don't be afraid to experiment. I actually have a lab on board the ship here where my volunteers come in and just try new things. That's a throwback from working at Google. By providing that creative space and whatever things we have laying around, we've come up with some pretty innovative solutions. And lastly, don't think that any solution that you build in-house is inferior to one that's quote unquote purpose-built. You purposely built it and it should be capable of meeting your needs. You should be proud of that. So here's another example of a scrappy solution that I did. I was kind of tired of putting notes on my door or having it knocked on and being disturbed in meetings. And so I needed a digital signage solution. Those, as it turns out, if you Google for digital signage, are kind of pricey. And so what I did was put together my own for a total cost of no dollars to the institution minus a little bit of labor. What I used was a recycled monitor. That's, I want to say that's a 19-inch or a 16-inch monitor. It was very small and nobody wanted to use it on their PC anymore, so it was on its way to e-waste. It's running on a very ancient Core 2 Duo laptop that's probably 15 years old or older, running Windows 7 with the original license. So I used the license key off the sticker on the bottom. That license didn't cost anything. It had PowerPoint loaded, so I am using PowerPoint, but if you didn't want to pay for a PowerPoint license, you could certainly run it under Open Office or Libre Office, and it is remotely controlled using Ultra VNC, which is also readily available and free. So on my desk, I simply pull up the remote via Ultra VNC, and I have a selection of signs to choose from. The one that's showing there in the example is because I'm still feeling a teensy bit under the weather, and I wanted to warn people before they came into my office. The one showing on the door right now says, be quiet, I'm on the air. So at this point, I kind of want to introduce my favorite tool. My favorite tool is a Raspberry Pi. It is not that Raspberry Pi, it is this Raspberry Pi. And it is an amazing little device. The Raspberry Pi Foundation describes it as a credit card-sized computer. It plugs into a monitor or a TV, uses standard keyboard and mouse. I love what they say here. They're very British. They're from the UK. They're actually based in the UK. It's a capable little device that enables people of all ages to explore computing and learn how to program. And it's capable of everything you'd expect your desktop to do: browsing the internet, playing video, making games, playing games, making spreadsheets, etc. We kind of view it a little bit differently. I look at the Raspberry Pi much like a Swiss Army knife. We do a tremendous amount of things with this little guy, and it is a fully functional computer, and the cost is typically around $35. So here's what we use it for out of the box. Every single screen that is playing video on the ship is being played from a Raspberry Pi. Now that is a $35 solution. It requires a case and a power supply, so all in you're probably pushing $50. It does connect to the network. It is remotely manageable. It does take a little bit of Unix skill to remotely manage it, but it is literally install the software and turn it on and you're ready to go. We also use it as an audio jukebox. We have a couple displays that have audio in them. The one that comes to mind is a Philco radio, where we're playing a newscast from the 1940s, and that is driven again off of the Raspberry Pi in its default out-of-the-box configuration. We use it to display still image slideshows in a couple displays. And ambient noise is a big deal. We are in a shipboard environment. When the ship was active, there was a lot of noise on board. There's clanking pipes and talking people, banging pots and pans in the ship's galley. There's all kinds of places where you can bring your environment alive with ambient noise. And again, looking at using the Raspberry Pi has a audio player that is in the default configuration out of the box. You add a $25 set of amplified PC speakers to it, and you have an ambient noise solution for well under $50. Well, a little bit over $50. We also use it to display websites, touch interactions. We use Volgistics to manage our volunteer force, and Volgistics recommends that you have a touchscreen workstation for your volunteers to sign in with. They recommend a Hewlett-Packard machine that runs a little north of $2,000. We recommend using the $35 Raspberry Pi and putting that money to use elsewhere in the museum. Here are a few things that we do with the Raspberry Pi that require a little more in-depth, not exactly out of the box or off the shelf. These require a little bit of programming and occasionally a little bit of wiring and adding some sensors to it. But we use it to produce motion detected audio or video. So when you enter a space or when you pass by something, it reacts to you. Specifically, the last one we did was on our chow line. As you walk by, one of our lifelike museum figurines actually talks to you as soon as you approach it. And it's kind of fun to see the interaction with the guest. We also use it for occupancy detected video. That's slightly different. If you are standing in a specific space, the video will play, and when you walk away, the video will stop. And in a museum space where you have a lot of audio and video that is competing, we use this to try to keep the cacophony of noise down. So if somebody is actually standing in front of a display, the display will be active, and as they step away and that space is not occupied, it will shut down. We used it in our curatorial storage, easy for me to say, to detect humidity, light, and temperature and graph that. We also, as the same kind of historical record keeping, record everything that's passed across our public address system. We use it to remotely manage with a piece of software that we wrote all of those video players that I talked about in the last slide. And we introduce more ambient noise into the public address system. Again, being on board a museum ship, these are things like bells at the hours to tell time and other sort of ambient things that would have been passed across the public address system while the ship was on active duty. We also have used it to do exhibit lighting control and lots more. I could spend hours talking about the versatility of this, but that gives you a pretty good idea, I think. So I'm going to pause here and see whether we have any questions or comments before we jump on to the next section. I'm not seeing anybody come off mute, or so I will move on. All right. I kind of want to build a practical example on what does a Scrappy solution look like, and what's the total cost of ownership, or not total cost of ownership. We'll talk about that, but the cost to produce. So in this example, I learned, I'm going to use PowerPoint, and I learned some of the things that that I'm going to show you by watching this video from presentation process, and I'm going to ask that that be put in the comments when we post the YouTube video. We're going to build very quickly an interactive slide, a single slide in Microsoft PowerPoint, and then we're going to deploy it using Libre Office on a Raspberry Pi in conjunction with a touchscreen. This could have been developed in any presentation program that's displayable by Libre Office. I use Libre Office because, again, it's free and it comes out of the box with the Raspberry Pi. I just drive PowerPoint a little bit better, and so I used the tool that I knew to produce the slide. Also, I didn't want to stumble through the production here on our lunch and learn, potentially making mistakes and having to back up. So I went ahead and recorded this, and I will start the video now. And if the audio doesn't come through, please let me know. Okay, I thought I would record a video of this next. Sorry about that, guys. Step. In the interest of saving time during the presentation, I'll just move the recorder out of the way. And what I'm going to do now is start PowerPoint. We're going to use a new presentation, and I don't really need these text boxes here. This PowerPoint slide is going to be a single slide that will be our interactive touch screen for the purpose of this demo. So the first thing that we want to do is we're going to select a background for this. We're going to use a picture or texture fill from a file. And I've set up a few files here in for us to use. So that's the background that I want. And we'll need to put a title on it. So we will insert a text box with our title. And we will put in here, please touch the picture of a Raspberry Pi for more information on that model. And we'll make it a little bit bigger. And we'll probably center it and make it bold so people can read it. A little bit bigger. And bold it. So now we have a nice title on there. And then I'm only going to create one of these buttons, again in the interest of time, but I'll show you how I went through it. And then I'll show you a completed slide that has a couple more buttons on it. So I'm going to start by selecting the ellipsoid tool. The ellipsoid tool, if I hold down Shift, allows me to make a circle, which is good. And then I'm going to select my rounded rectangle tool, and I'm going to make a rounded rectangle. It's a little bit bigger than my circle. I actually do want it a little bit bigger than the circle. And I'm going to send that to the back. And I'm going to change the fill color to something that's a little bit lighter. I'm going to grab this adjustment, I'm going to round it down so it matches the contour of the circle a little bit more. Then I'm going to add some text. And for that text, I use lorem ipsum, which is a traditional typesetting, just sort of gobbledygook, but it allows us to look and make sure that our typesetting is something that we want, that the format works. So we're going to make that smaller, and then I'm going to just cut a sentence or two out of there just to make sure it fits in our text box. And so that's what we want to talk about. That's going to be the information we're going to provide for the Raspberry Pi that they are going to select. So the next thing to do is to select our text. We're going to select the oval, and we're going to group those together, and then we're going to send the whole thing to the back, which should bring our other item to the front. So, of course, never proceed a demo with anything as predictable as, hey, watch this. Okay, so now we have our ellipsoid or our circle in the front and our oval out to the side. The next thing that we want to do is we want to put the picture inside here. So we're going to do that by saying Format Shape. We're going to fill that shape with a picture. We're going to select that from a file, and we are going to select a picture of the Raspberry Pi here and click Insert, Close, and that puts it there. And so this is what we want our viewer to see when they touch that picture of the Raspberry Pi. The next step then is to add the animation to make that happen. So we're going to select the grouped image, and we're going to say that we really want to see that wipe in. We'd like to see it go from the left, and we would like it to be triggered on the click of that original circle. I'm going to bring up the animation pane. Now, we all know that people are going to tap that and then walk away, so we kind of want it to go away after a few minutes. So we will then add an additional, and we're going to use the same exit. We're going to do a wipe out. This time we want it to go from right to left, and we want that to start after the previous, and we'd like a little bit of a delay. For the purpose of the demo, I'm going to use 5 seconds. And so put that 5 seconds in, and this is our timeline. So if we then look at, this is our test. This is what's going to be on the screen, and then when our user clicks that, it rolls out. It gives them the information that we've put in there, in this case our lorem ipsum, and then after a few moments it retracts. So that's the mechanics behind doing that. I'm going to open one of these presentations that I've already put together that has a few more buttons on it. And you can see here that if I select F5, I have a few different Raspberry Pis here. I have our traditional Raspberry Pi. I have the Raspberry Pi Zero. I have a Raspberry Pi Nano. And I have a Raspberry Pi that looks somewhat lovely to eat. And so this is the demo that we're going to put on our touchscreen for our guest to use. The only other thing to note here, when you're using PowerPoint, or we're going to actually run this on Open Office or Libre Office Impress, which is their version of PowerPoint or the presentation software. When you go to transitions, one of the things you want to do is make sure that this on mouse click is unchecked. And what that means is if somebody taps somewhere out here in the middle, it's not going to end the presentation or try to go to another slide. They'll just be able to click the spots that you have that you've set up for them and get that. And this could be used for a quiz, a true false, select the carnivore, whatever information is germane to the display that you're setting up there. So that's how we set up the display. Again, very simple, using a tool that most of us know how to use, PowerPoint. And now I'm going to jump back to the regular presentation and show you how to deploy that. Okay, so we do have a practical example. I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna stop screen sharing here for just a second and show you a couple things. I do want to do a caveat here. Nobody's exempt from hardware failures or software failures for that matter. That's one of my favorite pictures. I was actually, that one I believe is sincerely photoshopped, but I was at a Microsoft development conference when in fact Bill Gates blue screened Windows back in the day, 3.1, in front of a crowd of people. So why do I bring that up? Because if I stop sharing there and have my camera, this is a 10.1-inch touchscreen. It's a really nice AMOLED glass, looks and feels like a tablet. It is designed to work with the Raspberry Pi. And I had the demo running on this. And as I ran through the timing last night, shortly before midnight, just to make sure I had everything ready, the touchscreen failed and it will no longer power up. And it is the only one that I had. And so I cannot show you it on that touchscreen. However, I will not go without a complete demo. This is the same demo, also running on Libre Office. This happens to be on a Windows version, but again, you can hopefully see on the camera that it's going to behave exactly the way we did before and come right back. And then I will jump back onto the screen share here and show you that on a Raspberry Pi, I just don't have the touch screen. So if I share the whole screen here again, I'm just going to break out of this. And again, using Ultra VNC remote control software, this is a Raspberry Pi that is sitting on my desk. It's actually this guy right here connected to the network. It's the video is a little sluggish, and that's a feature of the VNC remote control software, not of the Raspberry Pi. But again, we can see that we can click these and they'll roll out and give us the same kind of behavior that we would expect. So I apologize for the touchscreen failure. It's just kind of the way it worked out today. But here is our 7-minute. It took us 7 minutes to build the slide. It took us about 5 minutes to deploy it to the Raspberry Pi. The screen that I showed you, unfortunately, the failed screen that I showed you costs about $125. The Raspberry Pi itself costs $35. The power supply is built into the screen. So for about $155, if you build a case around it, for under $200, you have a touch screen that allows your guests to interact a little bit more with an exhibit and get additional information, or again, do some sort of quiz or true false along those lines. So let me pop back to PowerPoint here. And bring Bill Gates up. So there's some caveats to doing stuff in-house, and you guys just saw one of them, and that is that garage-built tech can be less robust. It can be more quirky, and you need to be prepared to seriously test and tweak your solutions, particularly before you put them in an environment where they're going to interact with guests, because guests will do things to what you build that you can't even have possibly imagined. Next point is you or Google or somebody on your staff or the support line or help desk. And so there's no phone to pick up. You can't call. I'm obviously going to send this back to Amazon and I will get a new one, but I'm the guy that has to do the return via Amazon, and I'm the guy that has to wait for the mail to come in. And so you are the help desk. And finally, you're subject to the dreaded PM triangle. And this is true of anything that you do, but it is particularly true of kind of scrappy tech or repurposing things that for use in unique solutions. And that is that you have scope, which I like to refer to as features or functionality. You have cost, and you have time, and you get to pick any two of those to adjust. So if you want a lot of functionality and you want it deployed tomorrow, you best buy that appliance. The cost is going to be high, but you get it in a very short time with lots of features. If you want a really low cost and you want a lot of features, then you better be prepared to invest some time in that. And if you want it for a very low cost and you want it right now, then your feature set is gonna suffer. You're not gonna have very many features. When you try to adjust all three of these, then it's your quality that suffers. Again, your quality will remain in equilibrium as long as you give one of these parameters the ability to slide. But if you try to do it on the cheap with lots of functionality in no time, you're not going to have a quality product. There's just no way that you can do that. All right, it is now time for Q&A. I honestly hope that there was some Q&A. Because I left a lot of time for it, and I'll look to Celeste to see whether that's.
I have a question from Amy.
Sure.
Have you had success using videos within the PowerPoint Raspberry Pi format, i.e., instead of having the lorem ipsum text appear, a video plays when a visitor touches the button?
So I have had success doing that with PowerPoint, and so, but I have not had as much success doing it with the Libre Office or Open Office implementation. And so what that means is you can still build that solution, but rather than running it on a $35 Raspberry Pi, you're probably running it on something that will run Windows and will run a newer version of PowerPoint like 2010 or newer. Now again, 2010 runs on a lot of stuff. That's a 10-year-old piece of software. And you can still have a computer on the back end that does that, but it really becomes at that point a PowerPoint Windows solution. Video inside presentations is not the easiest thing to do. In-house here, we use MP4 video format, and we use the actual video player to do that. If I was going to do like a touch start, again, you could do that inside of PowerPoint, or you could actually leverage, let me hold this guy up. I don't know how much you can see on this, but the Pi has this bus along the top, and you can actually wire switches to that and then trigger videos to start based on like physical button pushes. I mean, there's a couple other options, and hopefully that answered the question. Okay. I do not know how to drive the question and answer session. So. All right.
We have a question from Keith. Do you have to have a network connection to every one of your Pis?
You do not. You can run the Raspberry Pi completely standalone and independent. The new Raspberry Pi 3 and now the 4 is out, has wireless available to it, which makes it a lot easier than having to run cables. We have all of them networked because one of the, I mentioned early in the presentation, a technology strategy is really specific to an institution. And as some of the people on the call know, I commute a long way. I live over 500 miles away from the ship proper, and I commute down here every week. But one of our design requirements is it must be remotely manageable. Everything that we do has to be manageable from offsite, and so we need to have that network connection. But the system works flawlessly without it. The only thing the network connection allows you to do is get in and troubleshoot or get in and change the video should something go wrong. And you don't have to physically be present to do so. But we had a couple of these that ran disconnected from the network for years. I just got them connected a couple weeks ago.
And we have a question from Carolyn. How long from start to finish does it take for you to set up a touchscreen presentation through Raspberry Pi?
So from start to finish, the slide, as you said, the slide can take as much time as you want to put into it. The more time you put into it, the better it looks. Once you have that interactive slide designed, out of the box, the Raspberry Pi has to have the operating system installed, and then you have to connect the touch screen. If you are using a touch screen that is a known quantity, and unfortunately I bought this 10.1 as sort of, hey, look at this new thing, and it failed me. If you're using a known quantity and you know what the driver is, it takes about an hour to set up the Raspberry Pi and probably a second hour to 90 minutes to get the touchscreen functional. And then it takes about 15 minutes to copy the slide over and set it up to auto run. And then probably another 45 minutes. I like to test the snot out of them. So I would say start to finish, if you have the slide in your hand, about 3 hours to deploy, plus whatever time it takes to build the slide.
Now from Keith, please describe the presence detection, i.e. parts, etc.
Okay, so this again is a Raspberry Pi based solution. You get the feeling that I really like this device. There's a couple reasons why we use the Pi so heavily, just sort of as a caveat. I do not have stock in the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I'm not even sure they sell stock. I wanted a device that was inexpensive and that I could readily replace. And so at $35, I have a drawer full of these. And if one of them fails, I just replace it. It's literally a disposable piece of hardware. The presence detection uses a sonic distance sensor that is compatible with the Raspberry Pi. And we use an array of those. So we have about 6 of them in a bar. And that pulls the distance. So by I mentioned that we had to write a little bit of software for this. In the code, we define how far away from each sonic distance sensor the wall or the barrier or the edge of the box we're concerned in is. And then when one of those sensors reads a distance that is shorter than that, we know we have somebody standing in that box or something obstructing that. And so at that point, we usually have an attractor video playing that says step up and hear about whatever they're going to hear about. And then when that box is violated, or when that sensor detects a distance shorter, then we kill the tractor video and we launch the video player with the content. And then once the box is out, we make sure that nobody else is going to come in. We give it about 10 seconds. And if the box hasn't been violated, then we kill the presentation video and go back to the attractor video. So that's all done in Python. It's about, 75 lines of Python. It is not a complex piece of software, but it is software that we wrote. It was actually written by a high school intern here that I was working with. Does that answer the question, hopefully? So how are services? So lighting control. This, I finally figured out how to drive chat, guys. Sorry about that. I mentioned lighting control. Is that just a single? What we did with the lighting control was we have an underwater exhibit that talks about exploration. In this case, a Bob Ballard exploration. And the effect that we were trying to get was, as a ROV approaches an item, they sort of loom out of the darkness. And so we have a model, and as the design on this, we didn't deploy this because we ran out of space in the exhibit, but we did build the technology. We had one of those sonic distance sensors, and we had the model illuminated with LEDs where we controlled the intensity, again, programmatically. So as the distance to the model decreased, we increased the intensity of the light. So you got this effect that as you walked towards the display, it got brighter, and as you walked away from the display, it faded into the dark. And again, a fairly simple piece of code, but it goes back to one of the points I made in the slides, which was you really need to not limit yourself by what you think can be done. We should always be thinking about, what do I want to get done? Because I didn't think we could do that, and as it turned out, it was a really super simple solution. All right. Okay, for folks that don't know how to code, are there great places to look for open source? Yes, absolutely. In fact, the dirty little secret is I spend most of my time on Google going, how do you do this? You know, what do you want to do this? And I grab lots and lots of samples. There is a huge open source community out there. And in fact, in looking at this, there's actually specific museum display software in open source for museums. It's built around museums. I have not played with it, but I ran across it just in the last couple of days in sort of fine tuning this presentation. So there are a lot of options for that kind of open source stuff. And then, as I said, our initial programming was done by a high school kid in the robotics program at the local high school. So if you can recruit somebody who's willing to just kind of bang around at it, you can get some really phenomenal results. So the question from Keith, how many audio backgrounds do we have? I want to say, and are they all presence activated? In fact, most of our audio is not presence activated. We have one audio that is motion activated, and that's the guy in the galley that says move along, or, you know, what do you want? The rest of them are just looping audio backgrounds, and we have probably a dozen of them. And there are things like in our galley area, they're banging pots and pans and hissing grill, sort of the background thrum of machinery. They're not complex sounds. And they just loop. They're usually about a 10 or 15 second track that just loops to provide that kind of ambient noise. And again, most of them are not presence activated. That is a completely off the shelf solution. You use the Jukebox that comes with the Raspberry Pi out of the box, and you use like a $25 set of PC speakers. The whole thing plugs together. That 3.5 millimeter audio jack just plugs into the Raspberry. You program it to start up and loop that audio, and you hide it behind something, and you're done. So again, from Keith, did I get audio stock files, or was I able to record? Strangely enough, most of what I have came right off of the internet in open source. Again, Google is your friend. I Googled for give me this sound. I did have to pay license on, I think, 2 of them, but it was like $2 perpetual license. It was single digits. But hey, Fleet Week's coming, and I actually have permission to take some audio recorders onto some of those ships. So we use a audio recorder solution. It's a digital recorder. It's a professional digital recorder. It costs about $160, $180. Has a multiple microphone on it. And then you can just go record the ambient sound wherever you want, and it records it in an MP4. So for those on the call that are not on Navy ships, you can record nature sounds. You just, anywhere you can take that device. It's handheld. It's about twice the size of a phone. Any place you want to record ambient noise, you can add that to your exhibit or to your experience. All right. So my chat's not blowing up with a lot of new stuff, so I'm gonna move on here and simply say thank you guys very much for the ability to do this. I love sharing this. I hope that the passion comes across. I love tinkering with this stuff. I think it's magical to bring things alive with it. And I think, again, just thanking our sponsor again. It's something I cannot do these projects without thinking about Barry. He and I worked alongside on a lot of this stuff. And again, just really honored and privileged to hold the fellowship for a year that is in memory of him.